session. We have here joining us from Zoom from Yogyakarta. I would like to invite Dr. Faris Al-Fadhat, a Vice Rector of University of Muhammadiyah Yogyakarta, as well as also a Senior Lecturer of the International Relations Department at the same university, who are already joining us here with us. As a background, Dr. Faris holds a PhD from the Murdoch University in Australia, with his research interest in international political economy, regional economic governance of Southeast Asia, as well as a role of corporate actors and capitalist transformation. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Faris to have the screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miranda. Good morning. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Miranda, for the time. Is my voice is clear enough in the?
Clear.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, we can hear you clear.
All right. Before I start, first, I would like to address the Honorable Head of the International Department, BINUS University, Rangga Aditya, PhD. First, I would like to congratulate for the 10th year anniversary of the department, which has grown into one of the top IR department in Indonesia, obviously. And Dean of the Faculty, Dr. Elisa Carolina Marian, Mr. Steven Santoso as the Chief Operating Officer, and of course, Professor Tirta Mursitama as Vice Rector of BINUS, and also other keynote speakers, Pak Andi Wijayanto, Professor Lena Rettel will speak later on. I would like to thank also the committee of the 11th ICOBIRD 2022 for inviting me today, especially Dr. Lili Yuliadi Arnakim, the General Chair of the conference. Apologies, I couldn't come in person, although I really want to come actually, and all the lectures and conference participants. Allow me today, this morning, to speak about the role of Indonesia in G20, especially with regards to the contemporary changes in global financial system, which has been experienced slightly changes in the last 20 years. Next slide, please. Our life today has been shaped enormously towards the globalization of the world economy, which, in my opinion, or many others will also share this opinion, that shaped by three interrelated divisions of circuits of capital. That our life today has been interrelated because of the production of commodities so enormous, and also related to the sale of commodities or the commodity circuit, and the last is money circuits of the accumulation of money or capital. For example, in terms of a production, for example, in the manufacturing sector, in 2021, just last year, the number was 16.3 trillion US dollars. That was increased 20% from 2020, although during the pandemic. We can combine, for example, for the last 20 years, in 2002, the production of manufacturing sector only 5.7 trillion. It shows how our life has been shaped by the production of commodities for the last possibly 100 years of capitalism, and the commodity circuits as well. And interestingly is that the number of foreign direct investment, which has allowed the mobility of money towards many different countries all over the world. For example, just last year, the amount of foreign direct investment was 1.58 trillion US dollars. That was increased enormously, over 64% from 2020, although we believe because of the pandemic, but the increase was enormous. But there is a consequences of that. Next slide, please. That the implication of that interaction of three circuits of capital. First, we experienced, especially for the last 20 years, especially the age of our students here, that we experienced the integration of national economies to the global value chain. That what we experience today, for example, has been driven by many production, many trade, many investment to all over the world. And the second is the unavoidable of inequality, first among countries, and second among individual wealth. Next slide. We see for example, the integration of indicator in the Asia Pacific, which includes Indonesia, and in big countries like Japan, China, South Korea, and of course, members of ASEAN countries. Before the pandemic, we've seen for 10 years, for example, the increase of inward direct investment, that money come into each country increase in total in the Asia Pacific 3.5 billion US dollars. And interestingly, in the trade, it has been growing significantly before the pandemic, 14% in the Asia Pacific. And Indonesia alone, we've seen that in the last, especially since the rise of China, we have experienced our integration to the China's economy, especially our dependence through import. Just take an example, last year, we have a very enormous import from China in electronic equipment, for example. We import in total 11.8 billion US dollars. In steel, 2.7 billion US dollars. Plastic, we still import from China. And of course, the pharmaceutical products also part of our import product from China. It shows not only how dependent we are from China, but it's really integrating the national economy to the world, to the global value chain, that we cannot escape from that kind of interaction. But the second consequence, which is not really a good news, it shows that how the inequality or inequality and imbalance between countries. I take an example, the richest country in the world, the United States, obviously, which has GDP for the last 20 years. It increased incredibly. Last year for US GDP was 23 trillion US dollars. China, I think in the next couple of years, China might be the largest GDP in the world. Last year, 17.7. Let's take an example. Next slide, please. Yes, you see here, that's GDP of the US is the largest, and followed by China. And I combined to Indonesia and the poorest country in the world, which is Niger. Indonesia, last year, we have 1.1 trillion US dollar as our GDP. But if we see in 2021, flashback to 20 years ago, right after the Asian financial crisis, which might be the year of the birth of our students, our GDP was 160 billion. That's our GDP now, although it's increased significantly, but still there are some huge gap to the developed or major economies. We see Niger, for example, it's really lower than any other countries in the world, just 14.9 billion US dollars. In 20 years before, in 2001, the country's GDP was just 2.4 billion. So this is the gap between countries. And also we see the gap among people or individual in the next slide. We see there is an interesting and provocative book, although the argument was very convincing. Thomas Piketty read a book in 2013. His argument was simple, that the rate of return of capital is greater than the rate of economic growth, which means that the accumulation of investment capital for big companies, corporations, is higher than the national economic growth in the last 100 years. So what's the consequences of that? Was the result of the concentration of wealth into small number of companies, and it caused the problem socially and economically. We've seen in many countries in the world, in Latin America, for example, in Venezuela, crisis since 2013, in the Middle East, for example, especially in the North Arabian countries, also the problem of economy. We also experienced that in 1997, 1998, for example. That's the consequence of the integration of the global economy and or the global financial system. What has changed for the last 20 years? In the next slide, I'll show that at least there are three interesting things that has changed in the global financial system, especially over the last 2 decades. The first, the obvious, and everyone knows about it, the rise of China and its evolving financial system. And the second, and very interesting, is that the emergence of multilateral cooperation and forums. There are two types. The first, regional economic governance, including us in Southeast Asia, and second, the global forum, World Economy Forum, and now is, I think, the most important one, G20, which Indonesia as the presidency this year. And the third, the global presence of the emerging middle power nations like South Korea, Italy, Australia, and including us, Indonesia. Let's jump into the rise of China. In the next slide, at least there are two obvious indicators of the rise of China. Next slide. There are two projects and institutions that has been developed by China, which signals very, very important the rise of China, and it will challenge the global financial system. The first is the establishment of AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was in 2016. The bank now has more than 100 members and more than 100 billion capital, equivalent to 2/3 of the Asian Development Bank, which led by the US, Japan, and also China in that bank. And importantly, also half of the World Bank capital. This is very significant that AIIB was sponsored by China. And the second project was Belt and Road Initiative, which many students, I believe, know about it already. The project has attracted over 148 all over the world total nations. Last year, the investment was 5.9 billion. But interestingly is like in 2015, the investment was so high. So what's the signal of this rise of China? The first, that China really tried to challenge or reform the international financial system, which has for the last 60 years dominated by the US, especially through the World Bank and IMF. And it's not really secret that the Western dominated financial system was actually causing so many problems all over developing countries in in African continent, in Asia, including Indonesia during the financial crisis, for example. And the second reason is that China really tried to internationalization of its currency, renminbi. It will challenge the US dollar supremacy, because the one significant indicator of the global financial system now still dominating by the Western countries is the use of the US as the single rate that can control the currency. But China tried to expand this. For example, I'll show later on how China tried to use the renminbi in many different countries, including in South Africa. But I will talk first about, in the next slide, the example of how regional economic governance really also helped shape the global financial system. Especially since the end of the Cold War, we've seen the emergence of many regional blocs which tried to develop the economic cooperations among regions. We have here in our region ASEAN Economic Community, which transformed from the ASEAN free trade area. For example, in Europe, we've seen the most successful one, European Union, with its single currency and single market economy. And in North America, we've seen also NAFTA, and even South America in the Middle East. So this kind of regional governance actually help shape the increasing mobility of trade, in investment and value change. Just taking an example in Southeast Asia, for example, we've seen the increase of corporate mergers, acquisitions, and investment all over the Southeast Asian countries. Now, ASEAN, the biggest part of ASEAN countries is within ASEAN. For example, the largest of investors in Indonesia is still among ASEAN member countries. It shows the significance of the regional economic integration to shape the global financial system for the last, at least since the end of the Cold War, and especially in Southeast Asia for the last 2 decades. And another global forum is, of course, the G20. In the next slide, we see the pictures how the leaders of the G20 leaders gathered together to discuss very important aspect of issues of the world. And this has changed significantly, tried to balance the Western domination of the global financial system. So I talk about such changes. So what's the implication of those changes for the last 2 decades? In the next slide, I see first that because of the rise of China, we've seen the global economic rivalry and contestation among major economies. This is the result, in my opinion, because of those changes that China tried to challenge the Western dominations of the global financial system. And we've seen this is the implication. Next slide, for example, we see the awkward picture of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. This is the result of a long deficit trade of the US to China. 2 countries has developed ties of trade, export and import since 1985. But since that year, the deficit of the US economies has increased significantly. In 2019, for example, the deficit of the US trade to China was 345.6 billion US dollars. That's a huge amount of money that's causing economic trouble in the US. And then we know the story how Donald Trump used that issues as a political campaign issue that brought him into power in 2016. And this is really as a result of the rise of China, and really the US see that as a really important threat to its economic dominance. And next slide, another implication of that changes actually the long-term economic dependence and financial crisis, especially for developing countries, including Indonesia. And second, debt trouble. We've seen many examples in South Asia, for example, like Afghanistan, many South Asian countries, and African countries. This is a very obvious example. We see the countries in the region has experienced different period of economic or debt trouble. In 1970s, for example, Western domination in African countries has contributed. Many experts believe that the Western economies contributed to the debt crisis of the many African countries in 1970s, although part of that reason because of the domestic economic trouble that really many African countries rely on export. And when there is a huge trouble in the global economy, they not really change quickly responding to the global crisis. But in 2020s, now we've seen that kind of a signal. For example, here, the next slide, there's a picture of a President Xi Jinping and the President of Zimbabwe. This is very interesting. If I mentioned before that one of China's strategy is try to internationalize its currency. One country which already signed renminbi as the official currency is Zimbabwe. This is part of the strategy of the China's economy under Xi Jinping to expand really into the continent. But interestingly is that the currency, the China's currency, is used as the national currency of the Zimbabwe because of the China tried to persuade and try to because Zimbabwe has a huge debt to China, and China's government tried to raise that debt, but the consequence is that, or the agreement was that the renminbi will be the Zimbabwe's national currency, and that really, in the long run, it will deeply make the Zimbabwe really dependent to China, and even going into the debt trap for the long run, which means that developing countries will have still long-term economic dependence and financial crisis for maybe 10 or 20 years from now. And the third consequence of the impact to developing countries is that the regional integration help increase capital flow, trade, investment, but not so much about equality. In the next slide, it shows the graphic of how the foreign direct investment stock in Southeast Asian countries. This stock is actually the amount of investment that owned by corporations in Southeast Asia, which can use to expand into different countries. It shows the increase in many countries in Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. I did not include Singapore here because the amount of Singapore's FDI stock was so above many other countries in the region. But this number shows that the integration of capital in Southeast Asia is huge, and it's easily make the production of many sectors of economy really easy, and integrating of the global value chains, the production in many different countries, for example. But this not really going into equality, because in the next slide, we see the wealth inequality by country. For example, Indonesia still has a 38 Gini index. 0 Gini index means good, 100 Gini index means worse. So it means that Indonesia is still having a problem in wealth inequality among people. This is interesting. Next slide. Interesting news from the Jakarta Post in 2017 that many people still has a gap between the richest and the poorest. Next slide. The changes in the global financial system are worsened by the pandemic for the last 2 years, and also the Russia-Ukraine war. And I think we've seen that's the prediction for next year, that the global economic recession is coming and will impact the whole world. For example, next year, the prediction for inflation will be 19.9, almost 20%, against this last September to 2020, Indonesia inflation was 5.9. We still think that our inflation not that so high compared to the global inflation. Now let's talk about the next slide, the primacy of G20 and the Indonesia's role. So G20, next slide, we see that the G20 is very, very significant platform right now. Next slide, please. That this forum combine all different international organizations nations from developing and developed countries to discuss various array of issues. I think this is the only platform that can discuss many aspects of the global problem. And also importantly, it's combined 80% of the world GDP. Although many people argue that the forum lack constitutive authority, but I think there is no reason international forum organization has gathered more attention to the G20. We've seen in Indonesia the euphoria of G20, for example, that shows that how our government really put an important attention to the forum. And importantly, this is the more democratic forum, which represents the developed and developing countries and could shape the future of global governance in terms of financial system. Now, next slide, we see that Indonesia's role, I believe it will be really significant through the G20 forum. Why? Because it might expand Indonesia's role beyond ASEAN. For many, many years, Indonesia really associates itself with ASEAN as the leader of ASEAN, as the largest market of ASEAN, and many other aspects that shows how Indonesia put attention to ASEAN and how ASEAN really rely on Indonesia. But through G20, it might provide a new platform for Indonesia to take a bigger role. But we still, best is not to take an ambitious goal, but really focusing what really Indonesia can play or advocate for developing countries, focusing on the regional leader and can be an advocate for developing countries or the voice for many developing countries. And also, Indonesia's roles should go far beyond this year presidency. I do not believe that Indonesia's role is enough within this year's presidency, but Indonesia should consider the longer role because many global challenges like great power rivalry, economic recession, health crisis, and even climate change actually will impact many developing countries, even low middle income countries, which Indonesia has responsibility as the advocate for those developing countries. Next slide. What Indonesia should do? First, I believe Indonesia should think about taking the role as a middle power status, especially for the longer strategic role. Even though if we see in the next slide, we don't have material power, because one of the reasons to have a middle power status combining two sources, first material power like economy or even military power, but Indonesia has the second power, which is the rule power. We've seen, for example, since the political reform, Indonesia slightly really engaged with the global multilateral forum, become really engaged with ASEAN in Asia-Pacific, and now become the presidency of G20. It means that Indonesia has a capacity to navigate the global forum through multi-platform, especially now the eyes of the world through Indonesia, especially in the next November to host the G20. And I believe Indonesia should take that responsibility as a leader, as a middle power status, to actually speak on behalf of developing countries and advocate of democracy and bridge builder. Next slide. The second rule, which I believe should do by the Indonesia, is identifying potential on the challenge for Indonesia and focus on the short and longer priority. For example, for the next 5 years, we're really focusing on the recovery of our economy since the COVID-19. But in the long run, we should think about global climate change. We should think about many developing countries which experience economic debt, trouble in their economy, for example. Or we also think about the security issues. That's something in the long run Indonesia should take as the middle power status. But of course, there is a challenges. In the next slide, I see that the rivalry will be there. We see, for example, last June or July, we see the difficulties of negotiation in G20 of the Ministry of Finance, which has a very difficult to take a decision. At the time, Ministry of Finance of Indonesia take like 14 issues to discuss during the Ministry of Finance at the time, but there are two issues that very difficult to take a agreement to all members. And I think this is because of the rivalry of great economies still within many negotiation, multilateral negotiation. And second, the inequality of economy of global like health industry, for example. Many developing countries still having a trouble with that. Indonesia should talk about this, although it's really challenging. But we've seen here the disparity, for example, that since almost more than 1 year after the vaccination project, high-income countries already above 70% of one dose vaccination, but low-income countries still under 30%. And the last challenges I should add, not on the slide, but should I add, is that Indonesia should, and maybe this is difficult, but try to boost G20 to build the capacity of multilateral development to better help developing countries deal with economic recession next year. Because, you know, try to use G20 as to balance the global financial system that's really dominating the world economy right now, like IMF, World Bank, and now AIIB, China's lead banking system, really might help developing countries, including Indonesia, to really navigate during the economic recession next year. And I think I will end my presentation here. Thank you very much, Dr. Miranda.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Faris. Please give one round of